The night is quiet, and you have settled in, your body heavy, your mind searching for rest. Let me take you somewhere far away, across centuries, into the misty hills and deep valleys of medieval Scotland. Together, we will drift through history, not in haste, not with urgency, but slowly, gently, as though walking along an old cobbled path where every stone tells a story. As you listen, let the calm rhythm of the words guide you into sleep. If you find comfort in these stories, remember to return here again, and let this channel be your companion for restful nights, soft history, and gentle dreams. Now, breathe deeply, release the weight of your day, and let us begin our journey. Life in medieval Scotland was, in many ways, a story of endurance. To imagine it, one must first picture the land itself. Scotland was, and remains, a place of rugged beauty, its landscapes, carved by time, by wind, and by rain. In the Middle Ages, the land was wilder still, forests stretching wider, rivers rushing untamed, and the highlands standing tall and harsh against the sky. The air was often damp and cold, carrying with it the smell of peat smoke from scattered hearths, the salty tang of the sea along its endless coastline, or the earthy scent of heather-covered hills. For those who lived there, life was bound to this land, both its blessings and its burdens. The people of medieval Scotland awoke each day to a world that asked much of them. Villagers rose with the sun, or even before it, to tend their animals, to fetch water from a stream, to walk long distances to fields where barley, oats, and rye grew stubbornly in thin soils. The rhythm of life was shaped by the seasons, planting in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn, and enduring in winter. Winter, most of all, tested them. The cold bit deeply, food stores ran thin, and snow sometimes made travel impossible. And yet, within these difficulties, there was a steady perseverance, a kind of quiet strength woven into the fabric of daily existence. In the lowland villages, houses were simple but warm, built of timber, stone, or wattle and daub. Roofs were thatched, smoke curled from holes in the thatching, and animals often shared the dwelling space, their body heat helping to keep families warm in the colder months. Inside, firelight flickered upon rough walls, casting long shadows. Meals were simple thick broth, simmered in a pot, bread baked from coarse flour, perhaps cheese or salted fish if fortune allowed. The family gathered close to the fire, speaking quietly, sometimes listening to stories passed down through generations. These were not stories for entertainment alone, but also for memory, for teaching, for holding on to identity in a land often shaped by hardship. In the highlands, life was even harsher. The land was rocky and steep, the soil poor, and the weather unpredictable. Clans depended upon loyalty and kinship ties for survival. Cattle were wealth, and disputes over land and herds often stirred tensions between neighboring groups. Yet, in the quiet moments, there was beauty, too. The sight of mist rolling down a glen at dawn, the call of a stag echoing through the hills, the shimmer of lochs reflecting the sky. For the people, these sights were not luxuries, but familiar companions, part of the enduring bond between land and life. Nobles and lords lived differently, though their existence was not without burdens of its own. Castles, built upon rocky outcrops or near rivers, stood as symbols of strength and authority. Their stone walls rose stark against the landscape, towers watching over valleys and villages. Inside, the air was cooler, the light dimmer, and the rooms arranged with purpose. The great hall was the heart of such a place, where fires burned in massive hearths, and where tapestries hung to soften the echo of stone. At long tables, meals were served, roasted meats when available, trenchers of bread, and cups of ale or wine for those who could afford such luxuries. Musicians might play softly, and talk of alliances, disputes, and politics filled the air. But even within those walls, draughts crept through, winters remained bitter, and the concerns of survival lingered, though in different forms than in the humble homes of peasants. Religion shaped the rhythm of medieval Scottish life as deeply as the land itself. The bells of monasteries and churches called people to prayer, their sound carrying across valleys. Faith offered structure, explanation, and hope. Monks tended not only to scripture, but also to practical knowledge, keeping bees for honey, growing herbs for medicine, and copying manuscripts that preserved learning through the ages. Pilgrimages carried the faithful across rough terrain to holy sites, their journeys both spiritual and physical trials. In moments of celebration or sorrow, the church was present, its stone walls sheltering lives that otherwise knew little permanence. Travel through Scotland in those centuries was slow and uncertain. Roads were rough tracks at best, often muddy, sometimes nearly impassable. A journey of a few miles could take hours, a journey of 100 could take weeks. Yet, travelers moved nonetheless, traders carrying goods, messengers bringing news, pilgrims seeking blessings, and soldiers marching to defend or to claim. Inns were rare. Hospitality was often sought from monasteries or from private households, where the custom of sharing food and shelter was as much necessity as kindness. Life expectancy was short by modern standards. Yet within the brevity of their years, people lived fully. Children ran barefoot across fields, laughter carrying in the air. Women spun wool, wove cloth, tended homes, and worked beside men in the fields. Men toiled with ploughs drawn by oxen, built with their hands, and fought when called upon. Festivals brought moments of joy, harvest feasts, weddings, and gatherings marked by music, dance, and shared meals. Around bonfires, songs were sung, and the past was remembered, even as the future remained uncertain. To speak of why life was brutal and medieval, Scotland is to recognize not only the hardships but also the quiet endurance. It was a life of cold winters, of meager harvests, of constant labor, and yet also of close communities, of deep connection to the land, and of traditions that carried people forward. The brutality was never the whole story. Alongside it was resilience, a slow rhythm of survival that echoed through the glens and across the LOCHS. As you lie here listening, imagine walking through one of those villages, the smell of wood smoke in the air, the sound of a stream nearby, the distant lowing of cattle. Imagine the stone walls rough beneath your fingertips, the straw crunching beneath your feet, the laughter of children, the murmurs of elders, the warmth of a fire glimpsed through an open doorway. This was life, hard, yes, but filled with small, steady moments that shaped the passing of each day. The land of Scotland, with its ever-changing skies and restless winds, shaped the very essence of life for those who called it home. To live here in the medieval centuries was to wake each day to a world where nature was both ally and adversary. A warm summer could bless a community with plentiful crops, while a single year of heavy rains or harsh frosts could unravel everything, leaving families hungry, villages weakened, and survival uncertain. Food, or the lack of it, was one of the central measures of how difficult life could be. For most people, meals were humble and repetitive, built upon grains and what the land could provide. Oats were common, boiled into porridge, or baked into flatbreads, simple and sustaining. Barley and rye filled out the diet, while vegetables such as onions, leeks, and cabbage offered variety when available. Meat was far less common for ordinary folk, eaten more during feasts or special occasions than in daily life. Salted herring, if caught and preserved, might make its way inland. Eggs, cheese, and butter were valued when a household had animals to provide them. Yet even these were not certain, for illness among livestock or scarcity of grazing land could deprive a family of their sustenance. Hunger lingered close at hand for many. A failed harvest meant not just an inconvenient shortage, but real risk. People learned to stretch what they had, boiling bones to draw out flavor, collecting herbs from meadows, even relying on stored grains that were coarse and hard to digest. It was not uncommon for bread to be mixed with ground-up beans or peas to make the flour last longer. In harsh winters, survival might depend on the generosity of neighbors or the supplies of a lord's storehouse. And even then, there was no guarantee of abundance. The daily rhythm of work was relentless. Men and women rose with the light and worked until darkness pressed upon the land. Fields had to be plowed, often with wooden tools drawn by oxen. Weeds needed to be pulled by hand, fences mended, and animals herded. Women, in addition to tending fields, cared for children, prepared food, spun wool, and wove cloth. The tasks never ceased. They shifted with the season but always demanded energy, patience, and endurance. Even children took part early, chasing geese, fetching water, or gathering firewood. Shelter, too, reflected the struggle of survival. Most families lived in modest dwellings, their walls of stone or wood, their roofs thatched with straw or heather. Floors were often packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or reeds. Smoke from the hearth filled the room, escaping only through small openings, leaving walls darkened and air heavy. Yet in the heart of winter, that fire was life itself. and families gathered close to its warmth, huddled together against the long nights. Privacy was scarce, comfort modest, but the sense of being together was powerful. Illness was another shadow that touched every household. Medical knowledge was limited, and cures were often mixtures of tradition, faith, and herbs gathered from fields and gardens. A fever might be treated with willow bark, wounds dressed with honey, stomach pains eased with peppermint or fennel. Midwives brought children into the world, with skill passed down through generations. Yet childbirth remained perilous, both for mother and child. Disease could sweep through a community, its causes poorly understood, its remedies uncertain. In times of plague, when sickness spread swiftly, fear grew heavier than the air, and many sought solace in prayer, believing that divine will alone could determine who lived and who died. The cold climate made life especially challenging. Winters were long and dark, the days short, and the nights stretching endlessly. Frost clung to fields, rivers froze, and snow-covered paths, isolating villages and slowing the already difficult pace of travel. Clothing was woolen, layered as best as possible, but dampness often seeped in. Shoes, made of leather, wore quickly, leaving feet exposed to mud and chill. Fires required fuel, and gathering wood was work in itself. Peat, cut from bogs, was another source of warmth, its smoky scent familiar across much of the land. Yet even with these efforts, cold was a constant companion, and survival meant enduring it with stoic resolve. The social order of medieval Scotland added another layer of difficulty. Most people lived under the authority of lords or lairds, bound to the land through obligations of labor, rent, or service. The wealth of a few depended upon the toil of many. Lords provided protection in theory, but for common folk, this protection often felt distant or incomplete. In times of conflict, peasants might be drawn into the service of their lord, fighting in battles not of their choosing, or losing their homes to the destruction of raids. The system was rigid, and upward movement rare, though loyalty and service could sometimes bring small rewards, such as a larger plot of land or exemption from certain duties. Despite the hardships, community ties held people together. Villages were close-knit, bound not only by necessity, but also by custom and kinship. Neighbors shared labor during planting and harvest, helped raise homes or barns, and celebrated together when seasons allowed. The sound of music, simple instruments like fiddles or pipes, lifted spirits in the evenings, and dancers turned barns or village greens into places of joy. Stories, told by the firelight, preserved memory and identity, carrying the voices of ancestors into the present. These moments of connection softened the edges of daily struggle, reminding people that though life was harsh, they were not alone in facing it. Faith, too, was woven deeply into the experience of living. The church stood not just as a spiritual authority, but as a gathering place, a calendar for the seasons of life. Festivals marked holy days, bringing respite from labor and giving shape to the passing of time. Candlemas, Easter, Lammas, and Christmas each offered moments of reflection, prayer, and community. Monasteries were centers of learning and preservation, their monks tending not only to scripture, but also to land and people, offering shelter to travelers, alms to the poor, and wisdom in troubled times. Faith was a comfort in suffering, a way of explaining the inexplicable, and a light in the darkness of long winters. Scotland was not isolated, and this added complexity to life. Raids, invasions, and conflicts with neighboring kingdoms often brought turmoil. Borderlands were places of tension, where farms and villages bore the brunt of larger struggles between rulers. Castles rose as strongholds, their towers watching over valleys, their walls built not only to house nobility, but to withstand siege and attack. For common folk, the sight of such fortresses could inspire awe, but they also reminded them that conflict was never far away. When armies marched, fields were trampled, homes burned, and stores of food taken, leaving ordinary families to begin again with little more than determination and faith. The brutality of life in medieval Scotland was, then, not a single hardship, but a tapestry of many threads: cold, labor, disease, and the weight of social structures. Yet through all of this, there was resilience. People adapted, found small joys, and carved meaning from the rhythm of survival. Even in the face of endless challenges, there was beauty, the glow of the northern lights flickering across a winter sky, the call of birds returning in spring, the laughter of children playing in fields, the strength of bonds that held communities together. And so, as you rest and listen, Imagine yourself walking along a narrow dirt path between low stone walls. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth. Ahead, a village comes into view, its thatched roofs clustered together, smoke rising gently into the twilight. A dog barks in the distance, a cow lowing in its pen, and the sound of voices carries faintly on the breeze. This was life in medieval Scotland, hard, often unforgiving, but always alive with the quiet determination of those who endured it. Imagine the highlands, where mountains rise like giants against the sky, their peaks often hidden in drifting mists. Here, life was even more demanding than in the lowlands, for the land itself was rough and unyielding. Fields were scarce, scattered in pockets where soil was thin and rocky. Families who lived here relied on hardy crops that could survive in less fertile ground, like oats and barley, and on animals suited to the terrain, such as sheep and goats. Cattle, prized for wealth and status as much as for their milk and meat, were moved from one pasture to another in a rhythm as old as the hills themselves. The weather in the highlands shaped every aspect of life. Storms could appear suddenly, sweeping across valleys with cold rain or sleet, turning paths into streams and grazing land into bogs. Winters lingered long, snow clinging to slopes and filling glens. Summer, though short, was cherished, a time when animals grew fat on grass and people gathered stores for the coming cold. Every sunrise and sunset carried with it the reminder that survival was a partnership with the land, one that demanded respect and constant effort. Homes in the highlands were often simple dwellings known as black houses, built low to the ground, with thick stone walls and roofs of turf or thatch. These structures were designed to withstand the winds that swept over the hills. Inside, people and animals sometimes shared space, the warmth of livestock helping to keep the chill at bay. Smoke from the fire curled upward, seeping out through the roof, filling the air with its sharp, lingering scent. Within these walls, families gathered, their lives close-knit, their days ordered by necessity rather than comfort. Travel through these regions was slow and often treacherous. Narrow tracks wound between mountains, across moorlands, and along rivers. A journey of a few miles might take hours, even days, depending on weather and terrain. Streams swollen with rain could cut off paths, and in winter, snow made many routes impassable. Carts struggled on such ground, so goods were often carried on the backs of pack animals, or by the people themselves. This isolation meant that communities were self-reliant, bound together by the need to share resources, knowledge, and labor. Clan life added another layer of complexity. In Scotland, particularly in the Highlands, clans were central to identity and belonging. A clan was more than a family. It was a network of kinship, loyalty, and shared heritage. Chiefs held authority, expected to provide protection and leadership, while their followers offered service and support. Alliances and rivalries between clans could bring both strength and strife. Feuds sometimes simmered for generations, shaping the history of valleys and glens, while at other times, clans stood together against outside threats. To be part of a clan was to inherit not only land and kinship but also duty. Men might be called upon to defend their chief's interests, to fight in disputes, or to join larger conflicts between lords or kingdoms. Women, too, held important roles within the clan, managing households, raising children, and ensuring that traditions and stories were passed from one generation to the next. The sense of belonging was powerful, but it also tied individuals to struggles that could bring hardship and loss. Religion was woven into highland life just as deeply as in the lowlands. Small chapels dotted the landscape, often simple stone buildings standing solitary against the vastness of moor or mountain. Pilgrimages to holy wells or ancient sites continued traditions that stretched back centuries. Faith brought comfort, but it was also a guiding principle in daily choices. From planting crops to resolving disputes, monks and priests were respected figures, though in many remote areas, their visits were rare, leaving local practices to blend faith with folklore. Prayers with ancient customs. Folklore itself carried immense weight in these lands. Tales of spirits, fairies, and otherworldly beings were told by firelight, passed down from one generation to the next. The landscape itself seemed to invite such stories, with its deep lochs reflecting the sky, its hidden glens, and its towering peaks. People spoke of waterhorses lurking in rivers, of ghostly figures wandering moors, of blessings and curses woven into everyday life. These stories were not merely entertainments but explanations, ways to understand the mysteries of a world that often seemed beyond human control. Daily life in the highlands demanded endless work. Men tended animals, repaired stone walls, and cut peat from bogs for fuel. Women spun wool, wove cloth, churned butter, and prepared meals. Children joined in as soon as they were able, fetching water from streams, herding animals, or gathering berries and herbs. Work and survival were inseparable, yet there was rhythm and continuity in these tasks. Singing accompanied labor, lightening its weight, while festivals and gatherings marked moments of reprieve, when music, dance, and storytelling filled the long evenings. The brutality of existence was felt most strongly when nature turned harsh. A poor harvest in these marginal lands could bring hunger quickly. Snowstorms isolated families for weeks. Illness spread easily in close quarters, and with little in the way of formal medicine. People relied on healers who knew the properties of herbs, roots, and charms. Some remedies soothed, others simply gave hope, but all reflected the deep desire to ease suffering. Through these trials, people endured with resilience, drawing strength from kinship, tradition, and faith. Scotland's political landscape added to these challenges. Kings and lords sought control, their ambitions reaching even into the remote highlands. Taxes, rents, and obligations were levied, often with little regard for the hardships of those who paid them. Raids by rival clans or incursions by foreign armies left destruction in their wake. Castles rose in strategic places, symbols of power, but also reminders of the unequal balance between rulers and ruled. The people who worked the land carried the greatest burdens, while those in high halls dictated their fate from afar. And yet, through all this, there was beauty. The stillness of a glen at dawn, when mist clung to the heather, the sound of a burn rushing over stones, clear and cold, the sweep of stars across a night sky untouched by city lights. These moments, fleeting and eternal, gave meaning to the struggle. Life was undeniably hard, but it was also rich with connection to land, kin, and tradition. In hardship, there was identity. In endurance, there was strength. So, as you drift deeper into this journey, picture yourself in a highland glen. The fire crackles in a low stone house, its warmth filling the air. Beyond the walls, the wind sighs through heather and grass, while the mountains rise dark against the night sky. Within, a family shares a simple meal, their voices soft, their laughter echoing in the close space. It is a world of labor and survival, but also of belonging and resilience. And though life here was undeniably brutal, it was lived with a quiet determination that carries its echo across centuries. The rhythm of life in medieval Scotland was shaped not only by the land and the weather, but also by the passage of time itself. Measured in seasons rather than minutes or hours, days were divided not by the striking of clocks, but by the rise and fall of the sun, by the calls of roosters, and by the shadows lengthening across the fields. People lived close to nature's rhythms, adjusting their work to daylight, and sleeping when darkness drew its curtain across the sky. In spring, when the earth began to soften, there was a sense of renewal, a fragile hope that perhaps this year the harvests would be kind. Men tilled the soil, guiding their oxen through fields that had been waiting all winter. Women planted herbs near their doorsteps, ensuring fresh remedies and flavor for the months ahead. Children ran across meadows, their laughter rising above the buzzing of bees and the distant bleating of sheep. The air carried the scent of growth, damp earth and new grass. Summer brought longer days, and with them, relentless labor. Hay was cut and gathered to feed animals in the winter. Crops were tended, and walls repaired. Summer was also a season of movement. Animals were driven up into the upland pastures to graze, a practice known as transhumance, and families built small huts of turf and wood, living close to their herds. These summer months carried a sense of community, for neighbors helped one another with the heaviest work. Music carried across the fields, songs timed to the rhythm of scythes swinging through tall grass. Autumn was the most crucial season, when harvest determined whether the winter ahead would be bearable or brutal. Grain was gathered, threshed, and stored, fruit collected, and livestock slaughtered for meat to be salted or smoked. The air grew crisp, the leaves golden and red, and the days shorter. There was a mingling of relief and worry, relief that the work of gathering was complete, and worry about whether it would last. Families counted their stores, hoping the barrels and bins would carry them through the long dark months to come. Winter was the test of endurance. The cold pressed in, the winds roared across the hills, and snow often lay heavy on the land. Villages grew quiet, smoke rising steadily from chimneys as families stayed close to their hearths. Work did not cease, but it shifted indoors, weaving, mending, repairing tools, and spinning wool. Nights stretched endlessly, broken by prayer, by storytelling, and by music. Outside, the world was stark and still, the trees bare, the rivers slow and thick with ice. Winter was the season when bonds of community mattered most, when the sharing of food, the lending of hands, and the comfort of companionship helped people survive until the first signs of spring appeared once more. The calendar of the church also guided life, offering moments of celebration amid hardship. Feasts marked the rhythm of the year: Easter in spring, Lammas at harvest, and Christmas in the heart of winter. These occasions lifted spirits, drawing neighbors together to share what little they had. Candles flickered in chapels, hymns rose softly against stone walls, and even the simplest gatherings felt sacred. Festivals were times of color and music, a break from the toil of survival, and a reminder that joy could be found even in the midst of difficulty. Yet even in these moments of joy, life was shadowed by the reality of hardship. Disease was never far away, and its presence was often sudden. The crowded conditions of homes, the close proximity of animals, and the lack of sanitation meant that illnesses spread easily. Fevers, coughs, and stomach ailments were common, and while many recovered, some did not. The memory of plague lingered across Europe, and though outbreaks were not constant, the fear of them remained. Like a dark cloud always on the horizon, medical care in Scotland was a blend of knowledge, tradition, and faith. Healers relied on plants gathered from meadows and hillsides: chamomile for calming, willow for pain, nettle for strength. Charms and prayers accompanied remedies, for the line between medicine and superstition was thin. Monks in monasteries sometimes offered more structured care, recording treatments in manuscripts. But for most people, healing came from within the community, from neighbors who had inherited wisdom passed down through generations. Amidst this struggle, there were moments of quiet beauty that balanced the severity of existence. Imagine a clear summer night in the highlands, where the sky is vast and endless, filled with stars that shimmer like frost scattered across black velvet. The lochs reflect their light, creating a mirror of the heavens, and the air is so still that the only sound is the gentle ripple of water against the shore. Families might step outside to breathe the cool night air, the day's work behind them, the promise of sleep ahead. These moments, though fleeting, gave life depth and meaning. Children grew up quickly in this world, yet they carried with them a joy that softened the hard edges of life. Their games were simple: chasing hoops, throwing stones, or playing with carved wooden toys. They learned early from their parents' example, imitating the work they would one day perform, helping to herd geese or carry water. Their laughter and energy filled villages with life, a reminder that even in a world of hardship, there was growth, renewal, and hope. Hospitality was another cherished tradition. In a land where journeys were long and roads difficult, travelers depended upon the kindness of others. To offer food and shelter was not just generosity, but necessity, for one day the roles might be reversed. Inns were scarce, so homes opened their doors, sharing warmth and bread. Even when supplies were stories were exchanged by firelight, and news from distant places carried through valleys where isolation might otherwise leave. Communities cut off, the nobility lived differently, though even their lives were touched by Scotland's harshness. Castles dotted the land, their thick stone walls designed for defense as much as for comfort. Within these walls, life was more secure, with better food, finer clothing, and more spacious halls. Yet even here, the cold crept in through cracks in the stone, fires smoked, and the winds howled against towers. Nobles held power, but they also carried responsibility, for they were expected to protect their lands, enforce law, and maintain order. Their feasts were grander, their clothing richer, but their world was not free of fear or hardship. The contrast between noble and peasant was stark, yet both were bound together in the same land, facing the same climate, and subject to the same cycles of nature. A lord's wealth depended on the labor of those who tilled his fields, and a peasant's survival depended on the protection, however imperfect, of the lord. This interdependence was both a burden and a bond, shaping the structure of society across centuries. Through all of this, resilience was the defining quality of life in medieval Scotland. People endured hunger, cold, illness, and uncertainty, yet they found ways to adapt, to celebrate, and to carry on. Their songs echoed across the hills, their stories bound them to their ancestors, and their faith gave them strength to face another day. Life was undeniably brutal, yet it was also full of meaning, and its memory still lingers in the land itself, in the stones of ruined castles, the outlines of ancient fields, and the tales carried forward through generations. And now, as you continue listening, imagine yourself walking along the edge of a loch at dusk. The water stretches before you, still and silver, the mountains rising dark against the fading sky. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of peat smoke from a distant village. You hear the soft splash of a fish, the call of a bird settling for the night, and the rustle of wind through the reeds. This was the world of medieval Scotland, harsh, demanding, yet endlessly beautiful, a place where every moment of survival was also a moment of connection to land, to community, and to life itself. The story of medieval Scotland is not only one of people laboring in fields or huddled by fires, but also of the rhythms of community, of how entire villages functioned like living organisms, each person a part of a larger whole. In these small, scattered settlements, life was communal by necessity. Few tasks could be done entirely alone, and survival often depended on the ability to lean upon neighbors, to share burdens, and to stand together when hardship pressed too heavily on one household alone. Villages were clusters of modest dwellings, their thatched roofs low against the horizon, smoke rising in steady trails into the air. Around them stretched strips of farmland, divided into narrow plots that families cultivated year after year. Beyond the fields lay common land, used for grazing animals, gathering wood, and other shared needs. The village green, small and central, might serve as a place for meetings, for markets, or for simple gatherings, where voices rose in conversation and children's games filled the air with energy. The soundscape of such a place was varied yet familiar. In the early morning, the crow of roosters echoed across the fields, mingling with the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep. As the day grew, the steady thud of hoes breaking soil, the ring of hammers mending tools, and the splash of water from wells and buckets carried through the village. Dogs barked at passers-by, while geese honked and flapped their wings near ponds. In the evenings, the sound softened, the crackle of hearth fires, the murmur of voices telling stories, and the occasional strain of music from a fiddle or flute. Daily work was not only laborious, but also carefully coordinated. Men ploughed and sowed, guided by the cycles of the moon and the wisdom of their forebears. Women tended gardens, spun wool into yarn, and brewed ale from barley, a task essential, not just for nourishment but for health, as ale was often safer to drink than water from streams that could carry sickness. Children too were woven into this fabric of labor, their tasks small but significant, gathering eggs, minding younger siblings, or chasing stray animals back into pens. Despite the difficulty of such a life, there was room for celebration, for the human spirit could not endure without moments of lightness. Seasonal festivals were bright markers in the long year. Beltane, celebrated in early May, was a time of fire and fertility, when bonfires were lit on hillsides and cattle were driven between flames for blessing. Lugnasad at the start of August marked the first harvest, a time of feasting and games. These festivals carried with them the echoes of ancient traditions, blending pagan roots with Christian observance, creating a rhythm that was both sacred and communal. Hospitality was a cherished duty, and in these villages, the arrival of a traveler was an event. A weary wanderer might be offered bread, cheese, or a place by the fire. Even if the household had little to spare, hospitality was seen as both obligation and blessing, for who knew when one might themselves be in need of the kindness of strangers? In this way, communities extended their bonds outward, linking even the most remote villages to the wider world through stories exchanged and news carried on the lips of travelers. Markets and fairs were another thread connecting Scotland's people. On certain days, villagers walked to larger towns, their carts laden with wool, grain, or salted fish, to trade for tools, cloth, or rare spices. These markets were not only places of commerce but also of encounter, where distant clans mingled, where musicians played, and where news from other regions spread. The excitement of such gatherings was a sharp contrast to the slower rhythm of daily life, and people often remembered them for months afterward, retelling stories of what they had seen or heard. Castles and strongholds dotted the land, looming above valleys or perched on rocky To the villagers, these structures were at once a symbol of protection and of power. Their thick walls promised safety in times of raid, but they also reminded people of the authority of lords and lairds, whose demands of rent, labor, or service weighed heavily on peasant shoulders. Life in the shadow of a castle was never free of tension, for the same stone walls that defended could also imprison, and the feasts within often contrasted sharply with the scarcity outside. Yet, despite these divisions, there were shared experiences across all levels of society. The Scottish landscape united its people in its beauty and its harshness. All felt the sting of winter winds, the relief of a bountiful harvest, and the solemn weight of loss when disease or conflict claimed lives. All looked upon the same stars. At night, the constellations guiding shepherds as much as nobles, the northern lights flickering across skies that made everyone pause in quiet wonder. The arts of storytelling and music were vital to this culture. Stories carried the memory of ancestors, tales of kings and warriors, saints and spirits. They were told not only for entertainment, but also for instruction, for preserving values, and for keeping history alive in the absence of written records. Music, too, wove through daily life, simple melodies played on pipes or harps, songs sung to mark labor, lullabies whispered to children. These traditions softened hardship, reminding people of who they were and where they came from. The role of women, though often bound by the expectations of society, was crucial in every household. They were not only keepers of the home but also workers in the fields, healers with knowledge of herbs, and custodians of memory through song and story. Their labor was constant, their resilience unyielding, and their presence central to the survival of families and villages. In times of conflict, when men were called away to fight, women sustained the rhythm of daily life, ensuring that fields were tended, children cared for, and traditions continued. Conflict was an ever-present shadow, whether in the form of clan disputes, raids across borders, or larger struggles between kingdoms. For villagers, these conflicts often meant little more than destruction passing through their lives. Homes burned, animals taken, crops trampled. Soldiers came and went, but it was the ordinary people who bore the cost. Even so, life continued, for fields could not remain unplowed, nor children unfed. The resilience of these communities lay in their ability to rebuild, again and again, no matter what storms of war swept across their land. Faith remained a steady anchor, the sound of bells calling the faithful to prayer, the flicker of candles before wooden altars, the chants of monks rising in stone abbeys, all of these wove the sacred into the daily. Churches, whether grand cathedrals in towns or humble chapels in glens, stood as centers of community life. Baptisms, weddings, and funerals all carried the presence of the church, marking the milestones of existence with solemnity and hope. In times of hardship, faith offered comfort, and in times of joy, it offered gratitude. And yet, for all its trials, medieval Scotland held beauty at every turn. Picture a quiet loch at sunrise, its waters still and glowing with the first light of dawn. Mist drifts across the surface, and the mountains are reflected with perfect clarity. The air is cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and heather. The fisherman casts his line from the shore, his figure small against the grandeur of the landscape. In this moment, the brutality of life seems softened, replaced by a sense of peace that comes from being in harmony with the land. So as you drift deeper into this story, let your imagination wander through those villages, across the hills, and along the shores. Hear the soft murmur of voices, the distant ringing of a church bell, the rustle of wind in the trees. Feel the weight of centuries pressing gently, not as burden but as presence, reminding you that life, though hard, was also beautiful, resilient, and deeply human in every breath and heartbeat. Life in medieval Scotland was bound not only to the cycles of the land and community, but also to the deep passage of time marked by the seasons. Each turning of the year brought with it both hardship and hope, a rhythm as steady as the tide against the rocky coasts. To live in such a place was to be ever aware of the elements, to watch the skies for signs of change, and to adjust one's daily patterns to the gifts and demands of nature. Winter, above all, was the sternest teacher. It lingered long in the highlands and valleys, covering the land with frost and snow. Days grew short, and the darkness pressed heavily upon villages. Work did not cease, but it changed its shape. Men mended tools, patched roofs, and sharpened blades by the light of the hearth. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and preserved food stored from the harvest. Children gathered firewood, trudging through the snow with small arms full of kindling, their laughter echoing faintly against the stillness. The cold was both companion and adversary. Fires became the center of life, with families gathering close for warmth. Around those fires, stories were told again and again of saints, of heroes, of long-past battles, and of wonders in the skies. The flicker of firelight danced across faces, softening them, making even stern elders appear gentle. Outside, the night stretched on, silent but for the howl of wind, the creak of timbers, or the call of an owl. In such moments, the vastness of the world pressed close, and the endurance of the human spirit shone brightest in its quiet determination, simply to last through the winter. When spring arrived, it did so gradually, a shy awakening rather than a sudden burst. Snow melted into rivulets that ran down hillsides, swelling rivers and nourishing fields. Shoots of green pushed through the soil, tentative yet insistent, promising life renewed. People stepped into the fields with cautious joy, ready to plow and sow once more. The air filled with birdsong, a sound that seemed to lift hearts from the heaviness of the months before. Markets reopened in fuller measure, roads grew passable again, and the world seemed once more alive with possibility. Summer was a time of labor, but also of abundance. Days stretched long, the sun lingering in the sky, illuminating both toil and leisure. Sheep were sheared, their wool cleaned and spun. Barley and oats grew tall in the fields, swaying gently in the breeze. Children played barefoot in meadows, their shouts mingling with the hum of bees and the rustle of leaves. By rivers, women washed clothes, beating them against stones, their laughter rising above the water's steady current. Fishermen mended nets, and smiths hammered out iron, the ringing of their work echoing across village lanes. Festivals punctuated these warm months, their fires and feasts drawing neighbors together. On hilltops, people lit bonfires visible for miles, their flames a reminder that life, though often harsh, was also worth celebrating. Couples danced, music played, and for a moment, hardship seemed to dissolve into joy. These gatherings were not only entertainment, but a reaffirmation of community bonds, a reminder that no one lived entirely alone, and that survival depended on these shared ties. Autumn was a season of urgency and gratitude. The harvest brought relief, yet also immense work. Fields filled with people cutting grain, binding sheaves, and storing food for the leaner months ahead. Apples, berries, and nuts were gathered from forests and hedgerows, while hunters brought in game to salt and preserve. Smoke from hearths thickened as meat was dried, fish smoked, and grain milled. The smell of earth, ripe fruit, and burning wood mingled in the air, creating an atmosphere of both satisfaction and preparation. Each household measured its stores carefully, knowing that what was put away in autumn would decide the comfort or hardship of the winter to come. Amid these cycles, life in medieval Scotland was marked by simplicity and constancy, yet it was never without moments of wonder. The northern sky, especially in winter, often filled with strange lights, the aurora borealis, shimmering in curtains of green and purple, shifting silently above mountains and lochs. To those who looked up, it was a sight of mystery, interpreted as divine, as magical, or as an omen. The night sky was a vast canvas, its stars not only a guide for shepherds, but also a reminder of the infinite. In a world where life was often short and filled with labor, such sights lifted the spirit, offering a glimpse of the sublime. Faith, too, infused every season. Monasteries kept their steady rhythm of prayer, their bells ringing morning, noon, and night, marking the passage of time, not by the clock but by devotion. Villagers gathered for Sunday services, their simple chapels filled with the murmur of prayer, the glow of candles, and the faint scent of incense. Festivals were tied not only to the land but also to the church calendar. Easter, Christmas, and Saints' Days offered moments of pause, reflection, and celebration. Even in the most remote glens, where chapels were small and priests few, faith offered a shared language, a binding force across the land. The brutality of life, though softened here in telling, was always present. Illness could sweep through villages with little warning, leaving families grieving and communities shaken. Crops could fail, leaving hunger gnawing at the edges of every meal. Yet, in the face of these trials, resilience was the true hallmark of the people. They endured, not with loud defiance, but with quiet persistence. Each day was met with the tasks it demanded, each season with the labor it required, Within castles and halls, life carried a different rhythm. Lords and lairds oversaw their estates, their authority extending across villages and lands. Their halls were places of both power and hospitality, where guests were entertained with feasts, where disputes were settled, and where the concerns of estate management unfolded. The contrast between noble and peasant life was stark, yet both were bound by the same seasons, the same weather, and the same reliance on the land. Feasts in noble halls mirrored the lean simplicity of village meals, only larger, richer, and more ceremonious. Yet both meals, humble or grand, were reminders of survival, of gratitude for what the land could give, and in both settings, stories remained central. Tales of kings and heroes circulated not only in great halls, but also in humble cottages. Minstrels carried songs from one village to another, weaving together the threads of shared culture. In these stories, Scotland's people found connection to their past, to their neighbours, and to the broader world. So, as we move further into this gentle telling, picture yourself within those cycles. Imagine the cold press of winter giving way to the green of spring, the labour of summer easing into the gratitude of autumn. Imagine the sound of bells across valleys, the glow of bonfires on hills, the hush of stars over silent lochs. Let these images settle around you like a blanket, reminding you that even in the most brutal times, there was beauty, resilience, and the steady heartbeat of human life continuing through the centuries. In the life of medieval Scotland, the home stood at the centre of everything. Modest, simple, and shaped by necessity, it was the foundation upon which daily existence rested. A dwelling was often a single room, walls of wattle and daub, or rough stone, and a roof of thatch carefully tied to withstand wind and rain. Inside, smoke from a central hearth hung in the air, drifting through gaps in the roof rather than through chimneys, which were rare. The fire served every purpose. It gave warmth against the cold, it cooked meals, it dried damp clothes, and it was the heart around which the family gathered. The furnishings were few but functional: a wooden bench or stool, perhaps a rough-hewn table, and beds made from straw or wool stuffed into sacks. Animal hides softened the ground, and tools hung upon the walls. A family lived close to one another, the press of bodies at night not only comforting but necessary against the chill. Privacy was nearly unknown, for space was small, but companionship was abundant. The sound of breathing, of murmured voices, of children shifting in sleep, all of this created a sense of closeness that was both ordinary and vital. Food was central, not only to survival, but to identity. The daily meal was simple, drawn from what the land and season could provide. Oats were a staple, transformed into porridge or oatcakes. Barley, too, found its way into bread or ale. Vegetables such as leeks, cabbages, and onions grew in gardens, while peas and beans offered protein when meat was scarce. Dairy products, milk, cheese, and butter were treasured, and honey provided sweetness when available. Meat was eaten less frequently, often reserved for feasts or special occasions, though hunting, fishing, and the keeping of pigs and chickens ensured that animal protein was not entirely absent. The rhythm of meals was tied to the work of the day. A small breakfast might be taken before heading to the fields. More sustenance followed at midday, and a larger meal was shared in the evening, when family and neighbors might gather. The act of eating was not only nourishment, but also community, a time for conversation, for sharing stories, and for reinforcing bonds. Around a table or a fire, people found comfort in one another's company. Even as they ate food that to modern eyes might seem meager, water was fetched from streams or wells, often a daily task that shaped the routine of households. The carrying of buckets, heavy and sloshing, was part of life, particularly for women and children. In villages, wells became places of encounter, where news was exchanged and friendships sustained. Alongside water, ale was consumed by nearly everyone, including children, its low alcohol content safer than many water sources. Ale brewing was often a household task, and its success or failure could affect not just the family but the wider community. Clothing was another reflection of both necessity and identity. Wool, plentiful from sheep, was spun and woven into garments that kept out the chill. Dyed in natural colors, clothing was sturdy rather than fashionable, though care was taken to repair and preserve garments for as long as possible. In noble households, fabrics might be richer, linen, velvet, or imported silks, and colors brighter, signaling wealth and status. But for the vast majority, clothing was functional, layered, and often patched, a quiet testimony to resourcefulness and endurance. The work of women filled every corner of life. Beyond tending homes and children, they brewed, spun, wove, and cared for animals. They gathered herbs from forests and meadows, knowledge of their uses passed down through generations. Women were often healers, applying poultices, preparing teas, and offering remedies rooted in tradition. In times of childbirth, women supported one another, midwives drawing upon experience rather than formal training. This collective wisdom sustained communities in ways that were seldom recorded but deeply felt. Men's labor was equally demanding. They worked the fields, tended flocks, built structures, and bore arms when called upon by lords or clan chiefs. Their lives were marked by both steadiness and unpredictability, the steady plow of soil one season, the sudden call to defend territory another. Yet, whether in peace or in conflict, their identities were bound to their families, their clans, and the land itself. Loyalty was a thread running through all, binding men to kin, to neighbors, and to the leaders who governed their lives. Children lived within these rhythms, their play often mirroring the work of adults. They shaped dolls from scraps of cloth, carved toys from wood, or made games from stones and sticks. Yet, play quickly gave way to work, as children were expected to contribute to households from an early age. Girls learned to spin, weave, and cook, while boys learned to herd animals, tend fields, and handle tools. Education, when it came, was often tied to the church, with monasteries and abbeys teaching reading, writing, and Latin to those destined for clerical life. For most, however, knowledge was passed orally, by watching, listening, and doing. Beyond the village, the land itself was both friend and adversary. The Scottish highlands, with their soaring peaks and deep glens, were beautiful yet forbidding. Travel was difficult, paths narrow, and weather unpredictable. In the lowlands, the land opened into more fertile plains, where agriculture flourished, but even there, floods and storms could undo months of labor. Along the coasts, the sea offered bounty in the form of fish, but also danger in its storms. The people of Scotland lived with this land intimately, knowing its moods, respecting its power, and shaping their lives around its demands. The castle towns and burghs were another layer of society. Markets bustled with traders, their stalls filled with goods both familiar and exotic. Fishmongers called out their wares, bakers sold loaves fresh from ovens, and cloth merchants displayed bolts of wool and linen. The air was alive with the scent of bread, the tang of salted fish, and the smoke of countless fires. In such towns, the social hierarchy was visible. Merchants, artisans, and guild members walked the streets, while peasants arrived from villages to sell produce. At the same time, nobles and church officials moved in grandeur, their fine clothing and entourages setting them apart. Yet all shared the same streets, the same crowded alleys, and the same need for markets that sustained life. Within monasteries, another rhythm unfolded. Monks rose before dawn, their chants filling stone halls with solemn beauty. Their days were structured by prayer, study, and labor, creating a world apart from the struggles of ordinary life. Yet monasteries were not isolated. They were centers of learning, guardians of manuscripts, and providers of aid. Pilgrims came to their doors, travelers sought shelter, and the poor found alms. In their silence and discipline, monasteries added depth to the landscape of medieval Scotland. Their presence a reminder of devotion and continuity. Justice, such as it was, rested in the hands of lords and lairds, whose judgments shaped lives. Disputes over land, livestock, or honor were settled in halls or open gatherings, decisions carrying the weight of authority. For the common person, justice could seem remote, yet it was part of the order that structured society. Beyond formal justice, clan loyalties and customs offered another framework, where disputes might be settled through negotiation, restitution, or, at times, blood feuds. In these systems, community and kinship were both shield and chain, offering protection but also binding individuals tightly to the fortunes of their clans. And so life went on, a tapestry of labor, tradition, and resilience. Brutality lay in its demands, in the relentlessness of survival. Yet beauty remained in its landscapes, its songs, and its moments of community. In every cottage, every village, every hall, people carried on with quiet determination, shaping lives that, though hard, were filled with meaning that is you listen. Imagine yourself there, in a small cottage warmed by firelight. or in a market where voices rise and goods change hands. Picture the sweep of heather across hills, the glimmer of lochs under the sun, the hush of forests filled with birdsong. Let the rhythm of medieval Scotland settle into your imagination, a reminder of how people lived, endured, and found moments of grace even in the most demanding of times. The fabric of medieval Scottish life was not only woven from the threads of labour, worship, and family, but also from the subtle rituals that marked the passage of days and nights. Each dawn was greeted with tasks, each dusk with reflection and rest, and within these hours were small gestures of continuity, the way a mother smoothed a child's hair by the fire, the way a shepherd paused to scan the horizon, or the way bells from a distant chapel rolled across the valley like a soft reminder of the sacred. The household routine was shaped by the rising and setting of the sun. Morning began early, often with the crow of roosters, signaling that it was time to stir the hearth back to life. A dull ember from the night before was coaxed with kindling and breath, until flames caught once more, sending smoke curling upward into the cool air. The first meal was small, perhaps nothing more than oat porridge or bread dipped in ale, yet it gave energy for the hours ahead. Families often ate together in silence, each aware of the tasks waiting beyond the door. Outside, the day was greeted with the lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the rhythmic creak of carts rolling toward fields, and the barking of dogs eager for work. The land was not only a source of sustenance but a partner in life. Every furrow turned, every seed sown, and every animal tended was part of a conversation with the earth, a conversation in which both giving and receiving mattered. Farmers watched the sky closely, for clouds gathering in the west, or the sudden change of wind, could mean the difference between plenty and hunger. Children, too, were part of this rhythm, their smaller tasks preparing them for larger responsibilities. They gathered eggs from wooden coops, fetched water from streams, and learned to handle animals under the watchful eye of parents. Play existed, but often in the brief moments between chores, tossing pebbles, racing through fields, or fashioning toys from sticks and scraps. Yet even in play, there was imitation of adult life. A child might pretend to herd sheep, or mimic the pounding of grain with small stones, rehearsing the roles that would one day define them. The role of the seasons remained ever present. In summer, sunlight lingered deep into the evening, allowing long hours of work in fields and gardens. In winter, darkness pressed close, days shortened to mere fragments of light, and tasks shifted inward. This rhythm, though harsh, gave a shape to life that was both steady and familiar. People measured their lives not in years as much as in seasons. How many winters endured, how many harvests gathered, how many springs seen after illness or hardship. Beyond the village, the roads and paths stretched out like veins across the land, connecting settlements, castles, and monasteries. Travel was not easy, for paths were often little more than muddy tracks, and rivers could swell to dangerous torrents after rain. Yet these routes were essential for trade, for the carrying of news, and for the pilgrimage of the faithful. Pilgrims might walk with staffs in hand, cloaks pulled close against the weather, seeking holy sites where relics were kept or miracles were rumored to have occurred. Merchants led pack animals laden with goods, wool, hides, salted fish, or imported wares from distant lands. Along these paths, encounters were brief yet meaningful, with greetings exchanged and stories passed from one traveler to another. The presence of the church was never far. Chapels dotted the countryside, their bells heard across fields and hills. Larger abbeys stood as anchors of both faith and culture, their walls enclosing gardens, cloisters, and scriptoriums, where monks bent over illuminated manuscripts. Inside these manuscripts, intricate patterns of color and gold, leaf-adorned pages, transforming sacred words into works of art. To the villagers who glimpsed them, these manuscripts must have seemed like treasures beyond imagining, for most lived lives where writing itself was a mystery, its shapes and marks holding secrets they could not unlock. The relationship with the natural world was as spiritual as it was practical. Streams and springs were often seen as sacred, their waters associated with saints or with ancient traditions stretching back into the mists of time. Standing stones, scattered across moors and valleys, whispered of older beliefs, their presence reminding people of ancestors whose lives were now folded into legend. Even as the church guided worship, these older echoes lingered, blending seamlessly with Christian faith into a unique and deeply rooted spirituality. Noble life, though different in comfort, shared many of these rhythms. Within castles, mornings began with servants bustling, fires lit in great halls, and preparations made for the day's business. Lords and ladies dressed in layers of fine wool or linen, attended by retainers, while meals were prepared in smoky kitchens where cooks worked over great hearths. Yet even here, the demands of survival were felt. Castles needed supplies just as villages did, their pantries filled after harvest, their cellars stocked with salted meats, grains, and ale. Lords might sit in judgment, oversee disputes, or train in arms, but they too watched the sky for weather, relied upon the labor of fields, and felt the bite of winter winds through stone walls. Feasting within castles carried a different atmosphere than the humble cottage meal, yet both were bound by the same necessity of nourishment. In noble halls, trestle tables stretched beneath banners and tapestries, dishes of roasted meat, pies, and spiced wine brought forth in abundance. Music played, jesters entertained, and stories were told. Yet, just as in the cottages, these gatherings reinforced bonds of community, not between neighbors, but between allies, vassals, and kin. For beneath the richness of noble life lay the same truth. Survival depended upon loyalty, upon shared strength, and upon the resilience of the people. Education, though rare for the common folk, existed as another thread of medieval Scotland's life. Monasteries trained boys destined for the clergy, teaching Latin, scripture, and the skills of writing. For others, apprenticeship offered learning of a different sort. A young boy might enter the household of a craftsman, learning to smith, to carve, or to weave. Girls might be placed with another family to learn the arts of household management, spinning, or brewing. Knowledge was passed, not in classrooms but in daily work, in observation, and in practice, ensuring that traditions continued unbroken across generations. Music and storytelling remained constant companions. In the evening, when work was done, voices rose in song, carrying both joy and sorrow. Harps and pipes accompanied gatherings, their melodies drifting across still waters or echoing through halls. Stories told of heroes and saints, of creatures in forests, or of ancestors whose bravery became legend. These tales connected people to their past, gave shape to their present, and hinted at hopes for the future. In the rhythm of words and music, communities found comfort, identity, and continuity. Amid all of this, the landscape itself was the great shaper of life. The mountains rose, indifferent and eternal, their peaks snow-capped even in summer. The lochs reflected skies of grey and gold, their waters calm or restless depending on the winds. Forests spread deep and mysterious, filled with the scent of pine and the rustle of deer. Heather bloomed across hillsides, painting them purple in late summer, a brief season of beauty before autumn turned them to brown. The sea, with its constant rhythm of tides, bound the coasts to the wider world, bringing both opportunity and danger. The brutality of life lay in the unrelenting demands of survival, in the long winters, in the uncertainty of harvests, in the sudden sweep of illness. Yet within this brutality was also a quiet dignity. People carried on, day after day, year after year, shaping lives of resilience and meaning. Their world was hard, but it was also deeply human, filled with moments of laughter, of song, of community, and of wonder beneath the vast skies of Scotland. And so, as you drift further into this telling, let your thoughts linger on these images: a hearth glowing in a dark cottage, the sound of bells echoing across valleys, a shepherd standing against the wind, his flock gathered around him, a noble hall alive with music and feasting, a monk's quiet prayer drifting upward in the stillness of dawn. These are the threads of medieval Scotland, woven together into a tapestry of endurance and grace. As the years rolled forward, the rhythm of Scottish life continued to be written upon the land itself, and every person carried within them a quiet awareness of both its beauty and its burdens. Life was rarely easy, but it unfolded in a manner that felt both inevitable and familiar. One could say that the very hardship of existence bound people together, shaping the way they related not only to one another, but to their surroundings, their traditions, and their understanding of time itself. The passing of days often blurred into one another, each morning greeted with the same modest rituals, each evening concluded in much the same way as the one before. And yet, within this repetition, there were small sparks of variation: seasonal festivals, holy days, markets, or the birth of a child, each serving as a reminder that even in a world that often felt relentless, life still carried surprises, Market days were among the most anticipated breaks in the ordinary rhythm. Villagers, who otherwise lived lives bound to the land or the sea, would set out early in the morning, baskets slung across shoulders or carts creaking along narrow tracks, to gather at market squares. The air on such days was filled with a particular energy, a hum of voices, a mingling of smells, roasted meats, fresh herbs, smoked fish, the tang of ale. Merchants displayed goods from near and far, bolts of cloth, pottery, tools, sometimes even small luxuries like spices, honey, or dried fruits. Children darted between stalls, marveling at bright colors or reaching for sweet treats, while adults haggled over prices in tones both firm and familiar. Markets were not only about trade, they were also a stage for the exchange of news. Travelers carried stories of distant towns, of shifting alliances, of battles or famines in other lands. Gossip wove its way through the stalls just as easily as goods did, and through these conversations, even remote villagers found themselves tethered to the wider world. The market was also a space for performance. Musicians played, jugglers drew laughter, and wandering storytellers captivated crowds with tales both old and new. These gatherings stood in sharp contrast to the solitude of daily labor, and for many, they offered a chance to renew connections, to see familiar faces after weeks or months of toil, and to remind themselves that they were part of a larger human community. Festivals, tied to both the agricultural calendar and the liturgical year, were another relief from the steady march of survival. The harvest festival was perhaps the most joyous, a celebration of abundance after months of uncertainty. Families brought offerings to chapels, thanking God for the crops that had grown, the animals that had thrived, and the very gift of survival. At night, bonfires might be lit, their flames reaching into the sky, casting flickering light across smiling faces as songs were sung and dances performed. These were moments when the sharp edges of life softened, if only briefly, and the weight of hardship lifted. In winter, the feast of Christmas brought with it both solemnity and cheer. Candlelight filled churches, hymns rose into the air, and tables, however modest, were set with the best food families could manage. For some, it meant roasted meats and spiced ale. For others, a thicker loaf of bread or a rare taste of honey. Whatever the scale, the festival carried with it a shared sense of hope and renewal, marking the turning of the year. Yet, beyond these bright intervals, the daily realities of medieval Scotland reasserted themselves. Illness remained a frequent companion, often striking without warning and spreading quickly through households. Remedies were limited, drawn from herbs, poultices, and prayers. Healers, whether wise women or clerics, did what they could, but often outcomes were uncertain. Life expectancy was modest, and each family had stories of loss: a child taken in infancy, a parent gone too soon, a neighbor weakened by fever. Still, alongside grief, there was resilience, a quiet acceptance that life was fragile, and that each moment carried value. Weather, too, remained a constant challenge. The Scottish climate, with its rains, winds, and sudden shifts, tested both patience and endurance. Crops could be ruined by too much water, or by too little sun. Herds could be thinned by cold, or by scarcity of fodder. Even travel could be brought to a halt when rivers swelled or roads turned to mire. The people adjusted as best they could, layering woolen cloaks, building homes with thick walls, storing food when possible, and always preparing for the unexpected. Despite such hardships, there was also a quiet intimacy between people and the natural world. Shepherds spoke softly to their flocks. Fishermen read the subtle signs of tides and winds. Farmers traced the soil with reverent hands. They lived not apart from the land, but within it, attuned to its moods and cycles. The sound of birds at dawn, the glow of sunset across lochs, the scent of heather on summer breezes, these were not luxuries but daily experiences, forming a background that made endurance not only possible but meaningful. Law and order, in their own way, shaped the lives of communities. Disputes were common, whether over land, livestock, or debts, and resolving them often required mediation by local lords or church officials. Justice was not always swift, nor always fair, but it provided a framework that kept society from unraveling. Punishments could be harsh, yet the mere presence of law offered a sense of structure in an otherwise unpredictable world. For many, faith remained the ultimate anchor. Chapels and churches, no matter how humble, were centers not only of worship but of community life. The tolling of bells marked time, the rhythm of services offered solace, and the presence of relics or sacred spaces provided reassurance in times of trouble. Pilgrimages, too, offered both spiritual and practical respite. A journey to a holy site was not only an act of devotion, but also a chance to step outside the daily grind, to see new places, and to renew one's spirit. Amid this tapestry of hardship and resilience, art and craftsmanship provided quiet beauty. Stone carvers etched intricate designs into crosses and buildings, weaving patterns of faith and heritage. Weavers produced cloth dyed with local plants, their hands guiding shuttles with practiced grace. Blacksmiths shaped tools and weapons, their forges glowing red in the dim light of workshops. Each craft added depth to daily life, turning necessity into artistry, and leaving behind traces of a culture that valued both survival and expression. In the evenings, when work was done and darkness pressed close, people gathered around hearths once more. The flicker of firelight illuminated faces, shadows danced across walls, and voices filled the space with song or story. A grandfather might recount tales of legendary kings, a mother might hum a lullaby, a child might offer a clumsy joke. These moments, simple as they were, carried a kind of magic, softening the world and reminding all who listened that even in the harshest times, there was room for warmth, laughter, and hope. And so, in every market, in every festival, in every quiet evening by the fire, medieval Scotland revealed itself as a land of contrasts, harsh yet beautiful, brutal yet deeply human. Its people, shaped by their struggles, also shaped a culture of resilience, community, and quiet wonder. As the seasons continued their quiet rotation, each carrying with it the unique trials and blessings of the Scottish landscape, the people grew accustomed to thinking of time not as a force to be controlled, but as something to be endured. To live in medieval Scotland was to live with an awareness that the land itself dictated the rhythm of survival, and that each choice, each action, was tethered to the vast cycles of nature and tradition. The beginning of spring carried a mood of both anticipation and uncertainty. Fields, softened by melting snow and spring rains, beckoned for planting, yet farmers knew well that any misstep could mean a season lost. Seeds were pressed carefully into the soil, tools passed from hand to hand, and prayers murmured with every turn of the earth. It was not uncommon for a priest or monk to bless the fields, sprinkling holy water along their edges, reminding everyone that no matter how hard they labored, the outcome rested equally upon the will of God and the mercy of the elements. As crops sprouted, so too did hope. Children ran barefoot across meadows, shepherds watched lambs skip in the fresh grass, and the sound of streams swollen with snowmelt filled valleys with gentle music. Villagers often took this season as a time of cautious optimism, preparing for summer's long work, but also enjoying the renewal of life all around them. Though their lives were bound by hardship, these fleeting days of warmth carried a balm that eased the weight of survival. Summer, however, was demanding. Long daylight hours meant longer labor, and nearly everyone took part. Men and women alike bent their backs to fields, while children helped tend animals, fetch water, or gather kindling. The scent of hay drying in the sun filled the air, and barns echoed with the steady thump of scythes as farmers cut tall grass for winter fodder. Fishermen set out early, their boats gliding across lochs and seas, nets glistening as they pulled in their catch. Markets swelled with the bustle of fresh goods, berries, herbs, fish, and woven wares. Summer was also a time of gathering, when neighbors exchanged news and families visited one another, knowing that once winter returned, travel would become difficult. Autumn brought with it a sense of urgency. The harvest was the pivot upon which survival turned, and families worked from dawn until dusk, reaping grain, storing vegetables, salting fish, and curing meats. Barns filled with hay, pantries with barrels, and smokehouses with the scent of preservation. Every hand was needed, and even the youngest carried baskets or tied bundles. The work was exhausting, yet it carried with it a sense of satisfaction. The knowledge that the household would endure the dark months ahead if the harvest was successful. Festivals and feasts marked this season too, moments of gratitude and communal joy that reminded everyone of the strength found in shared effort. Then winter descended, casting its long, unyielding shadow. Snow blanketed hills and valleys, roads became treacherous, and the sun lingered for only a brief time each day. Fires were stoked constantly, peat and wood consumed carefully, and families gathered close for warmth. Food was rationed, every morsel weighed against the days left until spring. The sounds of the season were quieter, the creak of timber in the cold, the howling of winds across the moors, the steady crackle of fire in the hearth. Winter in medieval Scotland was not merely a time of rest, but a test of endurance. Even in these conditions, communities found ways to weave beauty into their days. Songs, often carrying echoes of older traditions, filled long nights. Simple instruments, pipes, fiddles, drums provided rhythm for dancers in the glow of firelight. Stories were told and retold, some recounting legendary warriors or saints, others offering fables meant to guide the young. Each retelling linked generations, binding the past to the present in a living thread. Hospitality, too, took on heightened importance during winter. A visitor at the door was welcomed, not only out of courtesy, but out of a shared recognition that survival depended upon generosity. A bowl of broth, a place by the fire, a blanket, these were not only gestures of kindness but also acts of solidarity, affirming that even in the hardest months, no one was entirely alone. While much of the year was consumed by the demands of farming and survival, the sea remained a constant presence in Scottish life, shaping both livelihood and imagination. Along the coasts, fishermen worked tirelessly, their craft requiring courage as much as skill. Nets had to be woven, boats repaired, and catches salted for storage. The sea provided abundance, but it was never predictable. Its moods could shift suddenly, turning calm waters into storms. Still, it offered food, trade, and connection, and in many ways, it was both a giver and a taker, respected deeply by those who lived beside it. Inland, rivers provided their own form of sustenance. Mills, powered by water, ground grain into flour, their wheels creaking steadily as villagers carried sacks of meal home. Bridges, often built of rough timber or stone, served not just as passageways but as gathering spots where neighbors exchanged news. The presence of running water, whether in rivers or streams, offered both practical support and a sense of continuity, marking the flow of time as reliably as the passing of the seasons. Life in medieval Scotland was also shaped profoundly by kinship and clan ties. Families did not think of themselves as isolated households, but as parts of larger networks, bound by blood, loyalty, and obligation. These connections provided protection, support, and identity. When disputes arose, they were often resolved through these networks, with elders mediating or alliances formed to strengthen communal bonds. Clan gatherings, whether for celebration or strategy, reinforced a shared sense of belonging that made hardship bearable. Within these clans, honor played a central role. Though it could sometimes lead to tension, it also fostered accountability. A person's reputation mattered deeply, and acts of generosity or courage were remembered long after the moment had passed. Tales of ancestors were shared with pride, and children were raised to understand that their actions reflected not only upon themselves, but upon their entire lineage. The church, ever present, provided another layer of unity. Its influence extended beyond the purely spiritual. It structured time, mediated conflicts, and offered education in rudimentary form. Monasteries, scattered across the landscape, served as centers of learning, preserving manuscripts, teaching skills, and offering hospitality to travelers. For many, the sight of a chapel spire or the sound of church bells carried reassurance, a reminder that faith was a compass to navigate the uncertainties of daily life. Amidst all this, art and tradition wove their way into existence, quietly but meaningfully. Carved stones dotted the countryside, their spirals and crosses whispering of older cultures blended with Christian faith. Simple jewelry, woven textiles, and crafted wood spoke of lives that valued beauty even in scarcity. These objects were not always grand, yet they reflected a desire to leave behind something enduring, something that told the story of both struggle and resilience. And when night fell, as it inevitably did, life settled once again into its most intimate rhythms. A family might huddle close in a cottage, the smell of peat smoke thick in the air, while the soft sound of the wind pressed against the walls. A mother might hum a lullaby, a father murmur a prayer, and children drift into dreams warmed by the glow of the fire. Beyond the small circle of light, darkness stretched vast and unyielding across the land. Yet within that fragile shelter, there was warmth, there was comfort, and there was the quiet reminder that survival was not only about endurance, but about finding meaning in every shared breath, every flicker of flame, every simple act of care. And so, the story of medieval Scotland was not written in battles alone, nor in the struggles of kings and nobles, but in the humble, daily acts of ordinary people tilling soil, tending flocks, mending nets, telling stories, and keeping alive the fragile flame of community. It was a life often brutal, yes, but also deeply human, marked not only by hardship but by the steady, unyielding beauty of endurance. As time unspooled across the rugged hills and valleys of medieval Scotland, each generation found itself inheriting both the burdens and the quiet strengths of those who had come before. Life was often demanding, but it was never without rhythm, never without a sense of belonging. Even in hardship, there was continuity, and within continuity, a form of comfort. The cottages in which most families lived were small by any measure, but they were more than shelters. They were vessels of memory, where children grew into adults, where elders passed down wisdom, and where countless evenings were spent in the gentle glow of firelight. Walls of wattle and daub, or stone stacked with care, told of labor patiently given, while roofs of thatch whispered softly when the rains fell. Inside, the air often carried the mingled sense of smoke, stew, and damp wool. Familiar and grounding. Here, life unfolded in small but meaningful ways. The stirring of porridge at dawn, the folding of cloth, the sound of spinning wheels, warriors' women twisted wool into thread. These tasks, repetitive yet essential, gave structure to the day and tethered people to the ongoing rhythm of survival. There was a kind of quiet dignity in the endless cycle of labor, and while it left little time for leisure, it also forged resilience. Children were folded naturally into this rhythm. From an early age, they took on small responsibilities, learning through imitation, watching their parents, siblings, and neighbors. A child might be asked to fetch water, gather kindling, or help guide animals to pasture. These tasks were not viewed as burdens, but as gentle initiations into the shared work of family life. And in between, there was still room for laughter, for games played with carved wooden toys, for running through fields, or listening wide-eyed to stories told by elders. Education, as we might think of it now, was limited for most, but learning was constant. Wisdom was passed orally, songs that carried history, tales that imparted moral lessons, proverbs that condensed generations of experience into a single line. For a select few, especially those connected to the church or noble households, there was the chance to learn letters, to copy manuscripts, or to study the scriptures. Yet for the majority, knowledge was not written but lived, carried in memory and passed hand to hand like a well-used tool. The land itself was both teacher and test. Hillsides taught patience, rivers taught caution, and storms taught humility. People grew skilled at reading subtle signs, the way clouds gathered on the horizon, the way birds flew before rain, the way frost settled across fields. These were lessons learned not from books but from generations of careful observation. Each piece of wisdom handed down to help the next survive. Though life was rarely without hardship, there were also moments of quiet beauty. The morning mist rising from lochs, turning the world into a soft blur of silver. The sudden blaze of heather across hillsides in late summer, painting the land in shades of purple. The call of birds at twilight, echoing gently as light faded. For those who lived so closely with the land, these sights and sounds were not occasional marvels but daily companions, each one reminding them that life, even when difficult, held moments of grace. Community, too, was a source of strength. Villages worked not in isolation but together, whether mending fences, harvesting fields, or building cottages. Cooperation was not optional. It was the very foundation of survival. When one family struggled, others stepped in, for all knew that hardship could arrive at anyone's door without warning. Bonds of kinship extended outward into bonds of friendship, creating a web of support that caught those who faltered. Celebrations reflected this communal spirit. A wedding might bring together neighbors from miles around, marked not by luxury but by shared joy. Food would be prepared collectively, songs sung late into the night, and dances performed on worn earthen floors or grassy clearings. Such occasions provided release from the weight of daily work, reminding everyone of the pleasures of laughter, music, and companionship. The presence of the church intertwined deeply with these rhythms. Bells rang out to mark hours, festivals punctuated the calendar, and prayers accompanied both labor and rest. Even the simplest chapel, with its modest stone walls and humble altar, stood as a gathering point for faith and fellowship. Pilgrimages, when undertaken, carried villagers beyond their usual boundaries, offering both spiritual renewal and the chance to glimpse other landscapes. other lives. Yet even as people found solace in faith and community, they could not escape the uncertainties that defined their world. Disease, sudden storms, poor harvests, these shadows hovered always in the background. Still, it was precisely because life was fragile that it was treasured so deeply. Each birth was a cause for celebration, each survival through winter a victory, each shared meal a reminder that endurance was possible. Craftsmanship provided another layer of meaning. Tools forged by smiths, their iron edges gleaming faintly in firelight, were not only practical but often beautifully made. Textiles woven on looms carried patterns that echoed older traditions, binding the present to the past. Carvings, whether on stone crosses or wooden beams, added quiet artistry to spaces otherwise defined by function. These acts of creation affirmed that people longed not only to survive, but to leave behind something enduring, something that told of who they were. Evenings were perhaps the most treasured times of all. When the day's work was finished and the light faded, households gathered close. Stories filled the air, some recounting saints, others recalling legendary heroes, and still others spinning simple fables that spoke to children. The glow of the hearth softened the room, shadows danced gently on walls, and the crackle of peat or wood accompanied voices. These were the hours when families drew strength, not from fields or tools, but from one another, when bonds were renewed, and when the hardships of the day seemed less sharp. That as the night deepened, silence stretched across the land. Only the occasional howl of wind or cry of an animal broke the stillness. Inside cottages, breaths slowed, children dreamed, and fires dimmed to embers. Beyond those fragile walls, the world remained vast, dark and sometimes brutal, but within them, there was warmth, comfort, and the unspoken promise that tomorrow would bring another chance to endure, another chance to live, another chance to find small moments of beauty amidst the struggle. Thus, medieval Scotland carried within it a paradox. Life was harsh, often unforgiving, and yet it was also suffused with resilience, faith, and moments of grace. It was a life bound by necessity but lifted by community, faith, and the unyielding connection to the land. And in that balance, a culture was forged, one that, though tested by centuries, left behind echoes that still linger in the stones, in the hills, and in the very air of Scotland itself. As the centuries rolled forward across the rugged highlands and quiet valleys of Scotland, the story of its people continued to unfold like a tapestry woven with both dark and light threads. Though life was often marked by hardship, there was always a counterpoint of resilience, of endurance, and of small joys that gave meaning to existence. To imagine medieval Scotland is to imagine a place where the rhythm of life was dictated by nature more than by personal desire. Seasons commanded obedience. Winter insisted on preparation, demanding firewood, salted meat, and well-patched roofs. Spring required toil in fields, seeds pressed carefully into the soil, and prayers whispered for good harvests. Summer meant long hours of labor beneath sun or cloud, gathering hay, tending animals, and mending fences. And autumn was a season of both reward and worry. Harvests collected, granaries filled, yet the looming question always present: would it be enough to see the family through the long, cold months ahead? Amid these cycles, there were lives lived fully, though quietly. A shepherd guiding his flock across windswept hills, a fisherman casting nets in misty waters at dawn, a weaver at her loom, threads passing back and forth, building patterns both practical and beautiful. These acts, repeated endlessly, might seem ordinary from afar, but they were the substance of existence, the way survival was stitched together, day after day, year after year. And yet, within the humblest cottages and the most rugged hills, there was always space for imagination, for belief, for story. Tales of heroes and saints, whispered around the hearth, gave courage to children and comfort to adults. Legends of kings long gone reminded listeners that greatness could arise even from hardship, while stories of supernatural beings, fair folk in the glens, spirits in the rivers, and ancient powers that lingered in the stones, gave mystery to the landscape. Scotland's hills, lochs, and forests were not merely scenery. They were alive with meaning, alive with unseen presences that shaped how people moved, how they worked, and how they dreamed. That life could be brutal. Yes, illness struck without warning. Accidents ended lives in moments. Conflicts between clans or lords could spread fear into villages unprepared for violence. Yet against this backdrop of uncertainty, there was steadfast endurance. Families supported one another. Neighbors stepped in when one faltered. The church offered not only spiritual guidance, but also a sense of stability in a world that so often shifted beneath people's feet. The presence of stone castles rising on craggy hillsides, or abbeys standing firm against wind and rain, were more than physical structures. They were symbols of permanence in a land where much else felt fragile. Even when battle scarred the countryside, even when fields lay wasted, these buildings reminded people that something could endure beyond the individual life. And so, while the peasant labored in his field, or the craftsman at his bench, both might glance at such a structure in the distance and feel, if not comfort, then at least continuity. The markets, when they were held, brought brief excitement into otherwise repetitive weeks. Traders might arrive with goods from far-off lands, a bolt of cloth dyed in rich colors, a small bundle of spices, or a trinket fashioned of metal unfamiliar to local hands. For most villagers, such luxuries were beyond reach, but simply seeing them was a reminder that the world was wider than the hills that enclosed their valleys. It was a reminder that Scotland, remote though it might seem, was connected to the larger flow of time and trade, of peoples and ideas, and as much as the land demanded labor, it also offered solace. A walk along the shore of a loch at dawn might reveal water still as glass, reflecting hills in quiet perfection. A hillside in bloom might appear like a sudden gift after months of grey and frost. Even the sound of wind through pines or heather could soothe the weary mind, reminding listeners that they were part of a world vast and enduring, a world that had existed long before them and would continue long after. The bonds of family formed the heart of survival. Parents taught children by example, guiding them in tasks, showing them how to endure, and passing on wisdom, not through books but through gestures, habits, and patient words. Elders were valued for memory, for their ability to recall not only the lineage of clans but the mistakes and triumphs of past years. Around the fire, their voices carried authority, their recollections knitting together the present with the weight of the past. And through it all, faith remained an anchor. Bells ringing across a valley called the faithful to prayer, not only marking time but stitching communities together with shared purpose. Pilgrimages undertaken to distant shrines gave even the humblest villager a sense of participation in something larger than themselves. Faith provided meaning when crops failed, when illness spread, when losses felt unbearable. In prayers whispered at night, in the simple sign of the cross made before meals, faith offered a thread of hope in the darkness. As centuries turned, Scotland's medieval period shifted slowly into something new. Castles aged, villages grew, and the patterns of life adapted. Yet the essence remained, a people bound to the land, tested by it, but never defeated by it. They carried forward resilience, memory, and identity, qualities born not of luxury or ease but of enduring difficulty with grace. To close your eyes and drift into sleep while imagining medieval Scotland is to let yourself walk quietly through stone-walled villages, past cottages glowing with firelight, along hillsides softened by mist. It is to hear the lowing of cattle, the turning of mill wheels, the murmur of voices sharing stories in the dark. It is to sense the closeness of lives lived together, the fragility of each day, and the strength drawn from community and from the land itself. And as sleep deepens, perhaps you can hold on to the paradox that defined life in that distant age, brutal at times, unforgiving in many ways, and yet filled with small beauties, enduring traditions, and the quiet triumph of survival. In that balance lies the story of medieval Scotland, a land that shaped its people, and people who, in turn, shaped the land, leaving behind echoes that still linger in stone, in song, and in memory. And now, with that image gently settling in your thoughts, let the story fade softly into stillness. The hills grow quiet, the cottages dim, and the winds whisper across the lochs. You may rest now, knowing that though life was often harsh, there was always endurance, always connection, always the possibility of finding peace, even in the most difficult of times.